introduce Jonathan Kurtz, who is the principal of JKURTZ Architects. He's also been the design principal at Westlake Reed Laskowski. In 2012, Jonathan was the recipient of the Cleveland Arts Prize Emerging Artist Award and the BD+C 40 Under 40 in Cleveland. Jonathan is a graduate of Kent State University's Bachelor of Architecture program, and in 2004 he went on to get a Master's of Architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. Jonathan is a registered architect, and he has worked on several projects, serving as the design leader for various award-winning architectural projects, including the Oberlin College Bertram and Judith Cole Conservatory of Music building. Other notable projects Jonathan's been involved with include the first place submission to Prototype, the competition in Vancouver, British Columbia, that reanalyzes the idea of a skyscraper in terms of a podium and a tower, as well as the Haymary Cottage in Round Pond, Maine, and Jonathan's submission for the Village Red AIDS Memorial Competition in New York City, placed second as the national competition. It's my pleasure here to introduce you to Jonathan Kurtz.
Thank you, Sean. Is this working? Sound is okay? Okay, great. Well, thank you to Sean. Can everybody hear me there? Good, okay. To Sean and Andrea for having me. When Sean first introduced me to the lecture, he said it was about collaboration and craft, and he said it was kind of loosely about those topics. So he said, you know, a lot of people don't follow them, but I started thinking about what I could add to a conversation about these dualities, collaboration and craft. And I came up with the title based on, partially on this image. So there's a long history of a conversation between Sol LeWitt and Eva Hesse. I don't know if anybody's familiar with those two artists or their work. You know, largely in the 70s and 80s, but Sol LeWitt has been doing work for years. And they do very different types of artistic interventions, but there's a lot of documentation about this back and forth between the two artists. And I thought that as a kind of a notion of collaboration, two artists doing very different things, but that ultimately they resonated with each other. So there was this exhibition, what you're seeing here, where Sol LeWitt's work, which is very precise and ordered, was put on display with some of Eva Hesse's work, which is at times precise, but it's also very visceral, and kind of, she does a lot of things with latexes and rubbers, and it's largely about craft. And so I thought that that dialogue was interesting. And then there's this great excerpt, which I won't recite here, where Sol LeWitt is asked, Eva Hesse dies early in her career, and Sol LeWitt is asked to come into her studio and assess her studio. And this really struck me when I was going through and seeing, Sean gave me a great tour of the studio and the various studios today and the projects. And Sol LeWitt goes in and he tries to discern what is a work, what is a piece, and he has this great kind of diatribe where he says, you know, this is a piece, definitely a piece, probably not a piece. This is mostly stuff. This is definitely a work. And he kind of goes through and tries to figure out what of her production is a piece and a work. And to me, what that resonates with is kind of this idea that we're always putting together different types of constructs, but we're always, but works are always collaborative. They're always kind of the finished product. So this is Twins by Diane Arbus, another photographer. And the reason I use this is because these kind of dualities of collaboration and craft, or dualities that often appear in my work, there's a lot of what I call kind of twinning. So it's an oversimplification of terms in order to kind of understand them and weigh one context against the other. So while these are identical twins, I think what resonates is their internal kind of dialogue with each other makes them actually quite different when you look at them. So they're kind of a both and versus an either or. So these are things that we think about a lot in the studio: conjecture and consequence, intuition and intelligence. I don't want to talk over all of them, but these ideas that there's both and instead of either or within this world of kind of twinning or competing ideas. The last image as kind of a preamble is a work by Andy Warhol of Franz Kafka. So Warhol really mostly did portraits of celebrities, stars. So this was a rare part of a series. He did portraits of 10 Jewish intellectuals. And the image of Kafka, I think, resonates with me. And I always start, I talked to some students today, which was a great experience, but I always start my graduate studio with this image because I think, for me, Kafka's work is largely resonant with how I think I work or we work as architects, which is, has anybody read any Kafka? Is this familiar or not familiar? So Kafka's most famous book probably is Metamorphosis, which is a story in which Gregor Samsa, who is a salesman, wakes up as a bug. And at the beginning of the story, he wakes up and he's a bug, and then the entire rest of the story is about figuring out what the daily acts of life and his daily social relationships and all of the kind of hard work of things and situations means for that hypothesis. So there's kind of an outlandish conceit, but he doesn't invent the whole story. He finds what it means to make that conceit real. And I think that's kind of what we do as architects. We come up with a conceit. We have a conjecture, which might be outrageous or outlandish. And then the act of producing a work is really about letting that be subject to all of the kind of harsh realities that assail it, the politics, the economics, the kind of materiality, the fact that somebody else is building it besides you. So all of those things then work to kind of hone this conceit into really an identifiable work. So I'm going to show 10 projects. I have way too many slides, but I'm going to go through some of them quickly. I want to leave some time for questions. The first project I have never shown before. It's a book that I made just at the end of graduate school. It was exhibited at the GSD, or actually at the Carpenter Center School of Art. And when in putting this presentation together, I started kind of, we try to mine our own history for themes and threads. And so this work kind of came to the fore because I found so many of the things that were present here kind of recurring in my current work. I think it's quiet, but it's contextually interactive. It's a book that tries to elevate normative materials to a different status. It's a book which is about the process of making a book, and it's also both analog and digital. So I handmade the paper. I then wrote the poems, so the content was kind of from me, had meaning to me. I laser cut the poems into acrylic. I then inked that acrylic and ran it through a hand press to press the paper behind. So the poem is actually a double. It's a twin. So behind on the paper is the poem embossed, but on the front is the text in acrylic. And then I used tape and some other things to kind of do this work. And then there's this rubber binding, which is industrially fastened. So I drilled and cut and tapped the kind of black acrylic that's at the back, bound by these kind of rubber bindings. And then ultimately it became a spatial object. So I think this elevation of materials, the non-normative treatment of materials in the process of creating a work, and then ultimately that could become kind of a spatial element, albeit still a book, that contains all of these markings of the way we work with materials. I think this, again, some of the later projects, you'll see some of the materiality, some of the kind of interest in ambiguity and openness start to play out. The first project is at Oberlin College. Sean mentioned it. It was, I think, certainly my first work, kind of a complete work. The first I would maybe call a piece. Oberlin College is a progressive school in the poorest county in Ohio. It's remarkable because at times they've brought in a pretty remarkable range of architects who have worked there. Charles Gwathmey, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, Harrison and Abramowitz, Cass Gilbert, Will McDonough. They were the first school their first school in the country to admit African Americans, and they were the first school in the country to admit women. So, they have this real progressive lineage in the middle of this kind of strange place in Ohio. And the school ultimately also worked by Minoru Yamasaki, which this building was an addition to. So this is Wendell Logan. In 1973, Wendell Logan founded the jazz program at Oberlin. He ran the jazz program until the building was built. He actually did one concert in the new recital hall before he passed away. But I think his legacy in terms of taking the jazz program, which had always been across campus, kind of, jazz as an art form was never part of the conservatory proper. So they literally, the entire jazz program was housed in this former gymnasium, which is in a way remarkable when we think about, I was talking to some students earlier today about the way forms shape culture and the way forms can have as much influence as program on program. I think this, we wanted to create something new that would change the center of gravity of the conservatory, but wouldn't lose the soul that was embedded in these places. So the site we were given for this prominent building was a back parking lot. These are all buildings by Minoru Yamasaki. This is Tappan Square. Interestingly, the buildings get more and more value engineered as you go back. So this building at the back, which is a teaching unit, is 9-foot floor-to-floor concrete. It's remarkable in its own right. And we were kind of given this site. So the first kind of inclination was to actually make the building smaller than the site. So instead of just kind of attaching it somewhere to these buildings, we actually took the contrarian position of making the building smaller than it needed to be. We thought, as the only block in Oberlin that had both commercial retail and the college on the same block, all of these others, this is all college, this is all college, this is all college, 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 commercial. So the idea that the jazz program would move across campus, change the center of gravity of the conservatory, and ultimately be an armature by which the conservatory in this type of architecture could reach out to a larger community and ultimately start to, I think all of these schools, many of them, have this town-gown relationship where they're separate, and particularly a progressive institution in a county like this. So it was really important that this building set the tone for how the school was opening up to the larger community. So the initial diagram was really simple. It was a landscape that would course through the building, kind of what I call a compromised wrapper. So this way to enclose the building that would open up to pedestrians, but maybe form a facade to vehicles. And ultimately this kind of offices in the garden type of arrangement. And that diagram, kind of seen here in plan, so we took an already small, it's about 37,000 square foot building, held practice rooms, teaching studios, and a series of offices that would go on the third floor. All acoustically sensitive, all acoustically isolated. So walls were CMU construction with floated gypsum board walls to improve acoustic isolation. So a very heavy program at its base, but we really wanted to kind of open that up to people kind of traveling through. Ultimately, we connected below grade, so the plaza carries over a locker room area that all the students have lockers in. You can kind of come up in this connector that's wedged between two Yamasaki buildings. And then you can kind of rise on this side. And then on the third floor, where at some point in their matriculation, all students will have a teacher who has an office on this 3rd floor. We rung it with the offices, and we had this kind of central core, which was faculty lounge, and then a kind of a terrarium. I think you'll notice that a lot of the work really plays on this idea of building and landscape and how we embed one in the other. And not just that we embed buildings in landscape, but that we embed landscapes in buildings. And then the part of the program that was actually invented through the form is this, which the first time the dean saw it, we thought he was going to think we were crazy because we're poking a hole through the building and there's a lot of gymnastics to do this. But he immediately kind of said, oh yeah, the jazz program, they work 24 hours. They're like architects in that way. They work 24 hours. This is kind of the lantern and the social hub. So this space ultimately became a cafe and general kind of like hangout space for the students. So here you see that terrarium. We went to somebody in Madison, Ohio, who's the foremost expert on witch hazel trees, and he custom grafted 2 witch hazels for this terrarium. So what's interesting is the terrarium has a bit of a microclimate, and witch hazels are trees that give off color very early in the season. So the idea was that in February, when everything was cold and dark, you would get this blast of color here. And then this is a section kind of showing that hole in the middle of the building and the kind of under plaza connection, and then the cafe. So here you see the cafe. You see one thing I didn't include in this slide. This crosswalk used to go from the center of Tappan Square, which is here, and it used to come across the corner, so it stayed on city property. I think one of the successes of this project is that the crosswalk was straightened and it comes onto college property. So this idea that architecture can have this kind of social impact, and you see that kind of coursing down and coming through, a very kind of light space so that the activity from within is seen, and that ultimately that becomes kind of this urban street that really does, I think, work. So this is up in the cafe, place for kind of student appropriation, places that are less highly programmed but are important. I think there are spaces that we can create that you wouldn't plan to make them, but if you knew that they were there or you experienced them, you would never forget them. And I think that's an important kind of lesson. This actually happens. This was about a year after opening. Kids kind of sit underneath the cafe and have impromptu sessions, and the community comes and listens to kind of practices and concerts in that way. And then this is just kind of trying to show the kind of the combination of craft and care that makes people, I think, feel like they can appropriate a space or that it was made for them. This is kind of the front view. You see it's inside, it's actually a rather opaque building because you have all this acoustic isolation to deal with. But ultimately, this kind of exterior carries through the building between the structures and then ultimately up onto a roof garden that also, they had to occasionally close it because students were using it for things that they didn't intend. But there's this great kind of roof garden and a place also for concerts and for entertaining up there. Below that is the recital hall and recording studio. So I'm going to kind of talk about the skin inside a little bit more later. So with all these projects, what I'm trying to do I want to talk about kind of early conceptual development and organizational understanding, and then I also want to kind of pick a detail and try to kind of explain how that ties in. So one of the details here was the skin. This is Charles Martin Hall. He, on a block away from this site in Oberlin, invented as a student in 1897, invented the process for expedient conversion of bauxite to aluminum. And so he became the founder of Alcoa, and he gave the college Tappan Square. But not many of the buildings on campus were made out of aluminum, and we thought immediately this kind of historic resonance was as important as what the material was. So we partnered, I went to PPG Labs in Pittsburgh and then also ultimately to Lancaster County where they roll the aluminum, the mill-finished aluminum. And we came up with this kind of custom finish on the aluminum. And at the same time, you know, kind of tertiary influences, I was looking at a lot of Gerhard Richter, and what was fascinating to me was this idea at the time of kind of ambiguity and obscuring an image and the kind of softness that a surface could take on. And then in another instance, the fact that the material was the work itself. And so, you know, this was this idea that the sky and the glass and the metal could all be one thing, even though it had to perform in different ways and be articulated in different ways. So this is it at night, this kind of what I like to think of as like a Wes Anderson moment where you know, you get this kind of sectional view of a different student playing a different instrument in every opening. The kind of compromise wrapper that kind of folds to negotiate kind of problematic formal typologies. And then the skin was kind of this vertical orientation, one because windows, you have to consider the size in the windows because you need acoustic isolation from the outside and the inside. So these are all double insulated, isolated windows. And we took that material idea and we took it into the recording studio. So behind this, there's actually a wall that is a concrete wall that has diffractal panels that disperse the sound, and ultimately a curtain that can be drawn behind it to absorb all the sound. So they can actually tune the room, but it maintains this kind of this same appearance. So when the light goes down, the stainless steel mesh wrapped around metal angle just kind of flickers a little bit in the light. And then for the third floor, where we had a lot of sun exposure, we used a similar vertical pattern just through a fritting, and that became kind of a curtain around that third floor. 3 years later, we slowly moved inside, and this is a project also for the conservatory, but it's in Bibbins Hall. So Bibbins was the front building, and we had the challenge of having to find, we were renovating the entire building, but we had to find within it space for a recital hall. So this was the last building Minoru Yamasaki did before the World Trade Center. So it's all a structural skin and then a few columns down the corridor inside. All concrete, all isolated. I think you could imagine it's kind of difficult to find ways to negotiate that material constriction. So this was an existing classroom, ceiling lighting, the corridors terminated in doors, not incredibly inviting, but very useful for them, just a plan. So the main idea became that we could fit a recital hall for about 60 in an area of 2 classrooms. We could remove the classrooms, but that didn't solve the volumetric challenge. So what we did is we terminated the corridor in glazing so that you could see out. You would enter both ways because we were over 50 occupants, so you have to find multiple ways out. Those of you teaching the studios where they need fire and egress stairs, all that stuff, you figure out. And then ultimately one large room inside. So this is kind of a new kind of student waiting area. So when there is a recital or a concert, you can actually see the occupants and you can kind of interact with that in the corridor. It really opens the corridor up to the activity. This is a section. So we created a box truss that sat on the roof, bolted it in, and then afterwards cut out the concrete ceiling in order to get the volume that was needed, because you can't just put a recital room into a 9 or 10 foot ceiling. You have to kind of create the acoustic volume for that. So that's kind of what you're seeing here. So the challenge with that is that we wanted to maintain the minimalism and simplicity of the Yamasaki building, that we thought it was important to make it a cohesive whole and not be kind of vertically striated as you moved up, that it felt like you were enclosed. So the solution was to create this kind of basket out of simple dowels. These are dowels you would buy at Home Depot, just maple. And the detail in this project that I want to share is that even simple ideas are actually sometimes complex based on the constraints. So in an acoustic building, what you'll have, if you used all the same dowels and they were all the same length, you would have a resonant frequency that when certain notes were hit, the entire room would have a tune to it. So you have to avoid that. So we configured the screen in this kind of parallelograms to mimic the angle of the Yamasaki windows, but also follow the angle of the truss above. And then these kind of simple vertical elements. So these are actually 3 different diameters of dowel, from 3/8 to half to 5/8, and they're at different spacings depending on the panel. And that change in spacing, change in dowel diameter, and then this vertical, which makes them almost kind of infinitely variable because it ties them together, ultimately makes it a range. So the room actually kind of resonates with the music versus kind of fighting it at certain tunes. This is kind of forming the lantern on the corner. We had a hard time with the historic review board, but ultimately got through. We just wanted it to be a simple kind of quiet lantern, but we needed the volume. And this is the space in use. The next project is definitely just a piece. I was asked by the editors of Clog to join an exhibition they called 5 by 5. It was 5 conceits taken on by 5 architects each. This traveled around, maybe 4 years ago. And as the good architect I try to be, I took the conceit that was left over. So everybody else chose, and I was too late to pick mine. So I got Lunar Resort. I don't know that it was a passion of mine to have. Other ones were the Trump Wall or the tower, or things that were more glamorous formally. But and so the premise that was given by the Lunar Resort is what struck me as this idea of luxury tourism, and I was kind of thinking a lot about what it meant to be in the world now, not to be too hyperbolic about that, but and I came up with this. I don't necessarily want to talk over it. Maybe I'll just read it very quickly. Excess absence, too much, nothing, no atmosphere, daylight for 13 days, starlight for 13 days, a lunar resort, luxury tourism, no media, no brand, no identity. Perhaps real luxury is affording nothing, procuring space, no atmosphere. A foggy drizzle against sharp gray. We have always been in the business of assembling qualities. A resort of material, ambiance, absorption, intuition, nature on command, nestled in the edge of a crater, gazing back at the earth, all day, every day, the ultimate aerial omniscience control, wondering if we can model atmosphere under a black sky. So what does this mean? Partially it's that I have written, I wrote these poems early for the book I showed at the beginning. The first Clog exhibition was on Bjarkingles, and I wrote a poem in Excel. I'm not a poet, I admit it. But this kind of narrative underpinning is one way that I really think about and try to approach work. So this was a project that was experimenting with, I call it a piece because these pieces are never really complete, and they're always a little bit riskier, I think, than the built works. But it was still these experiments. This is actually a black rubber volume, wood, again, analog and digital, highly hand-polished aluminum that I kind of formed into this half circle shape so that you could get this reflection up in. And I was playing with this idea of scalelessness. So the idea that this might be the landing spot for a drone port, but these atmospheres, fog, kind of a memory, landscape, like what are the different kind of atmospheres that as luxury tourists we might want to call upon. So just kind of this idea that at different scales, at different kind of modes of operating, what does it mean to build for me it was what does it mean to build something that evokes these qualities of ambiguity and atmosphere, both materially and formally. So I put these together because I think pieces find their way into works. This is the first time I've ever started a description of a project with the bathroom. But this is the bathroom of the Birnbaum, which was the third project that I'm going to show for Oberlin. It's the most recent one. It was completed in 2016. But again, this idea of kind of ambiguity, reflectivity, atmosphere, kind of interactive materials. So first project I got to do there was in a relatively prominent site. They gave us a parking lot. The second one was indoors, and then this one's in a basement. So I'm slowly being moved inside. This is in a storage room in a hotel that was recently completed in Oberlin. And what we were given was basically kind of this outline to build an innovation and performance space. So the dean had this idea that students and entrepreneurs should kind of come together, and that because the conservatory is one of the top 2 to 3 conservatories in the country, that there should be a place where the students can feel like they got their first gig in New York. Sorry, I'm going to have a little drink of water. We took the approach of inserting a series of objects into this shell, 5 of them, a restroom cluster, what we call the stage cluster, a bar, and then the infrastructure and a small gallery. The big move was to essentially kind of bifurcate the space that we had available. This was the only opening and the only access to natural light, so we had a hole that we inserted a stair into to come down, and then you would have this kind of pre-function space, a series of restrooms that all kind of shared one sink facility, and then kind of a flexible arrangement for the performance space and bar. This was the start, and this material was actually kind of the core impetus for the project. So it was a beautiful concrete wall that we thought, okay, the only thing that's established are the grid lines of the concrete, because that was poured long before this even became a project. We have to build off that, and then there was this great moment where you get light in, but it's the only place you get light. Unfortunately, at some point, because it was supposed to be storage, the architects of the hotel project, of which this was a subset, had specified to paint the concrete. So the dean called one Saturday afternoon and said, they've painted all the concrete white, we can't do this. We were halfway through the design, and it was, you just couldn't do it. And I show this because everybody resisted. There was no way to get the concrete off, the paint off. They wanted to paint it, the contractor, not to belabor it, but the contractors had all of these ideas about painting it dark and it'll be the same thing. I and one other person from the office spent weekends and rented pressure washers from Home Depot. I tried at least 14 different stripping kits, and ultimately this kind of one product that is an environmental product actually worked the best, and we kind of got to this and we said, finally, they were about to, I think it was a 2.5 month and a half process probably. Finally we said, it can be done, you just have to have your people do it. And so that was enough for the dean to kind of say, yeah, you've got to do it. We let them, there's still some white up underneath some of this other stuff, so we really kind of tried to stay strategic, but I think for me, this was what the whole project was about, and we couldn't sacrifice that. And I think, that momentum kind of built the project in a way that if we hadn't had to make that effort, it wouldn't be the same. The other kind of material quality that was at play was I had the opportunity, I know I'm terrible musically, I have no musical ability, but I got to go to the Steinway factory in New York to help them pick out the Steinway. So Oberlin has the luxury of having the largest Steinway collection in the country of any school. I think they have 200 and some. But this was the Steinway we selected, and they're all similar, but they're not all the same. So, this interior, the board, the kind of rosewood lining, and this kind of heavily lacquered, like multiple coat black lacquer luster really kind of drove our thinking on the materiality of the project. So again, it goes back to this idea of kind of material ambiguity, and we really wanted to make curtains and concrete feel the same. So what does softness mean when it comes to material? So these are felt curtains and concrete, and we lined things with cork in different manifestations. The tables we did custom. We had somebody make them, and we put rubber on top. So they're honed and shiny and look hard, but actually when you put your drink down on them, it doesn't make a sound. It's just quiet. And they're this triangular shape, which works out actually really well to like have different size groupings. So we thought for a club, it's kind of really a kind of cool approach. We perforated black metal. So you take a metal, which should be a hard material, and you make it soft. You make it absorptive. We kind of used a cork tile with a grout, and again, kind of the material. So really the interest was in this play of materiality and wondering, it's not about the photograph, it's about the feeling of being in that space. You see the bar, we had these kind of warm cork with the blackened cork on the outside. So we used cork. The bar top is all cork, the front of the bar is all rubber. So constantly using the same materials, but treating them differently for different applications. And then out in the kind of foyer room is this kind of impromptu gallery, that stair that comes down. This is kind of a pivot door that we created to go in and out. The floors were left concrete, but we left it polished in this space while we honed it in the main space. And then the only thing we got on the exterior was this sign. We did the signage as well. So it was called the Beerenbaum because money was given by Chuck Beerenbaum, but we thought the Beerenbaum was a cool name anyway. But the stair, again, is this combination of kind of rugged, and we left this aperture in the roof of that vestibule entry to let light in at different times. Interesting thing about the stair is that it's a structural C, so the plate of the stair is actually self-supporting, and there were a lot of iterations where they were putting posts in different places that we resisted, but ultimately we thought the integrity of having that initial concept carried through was really important. Hawkins School is a progressive private education school in Northeast Ohio. It is a progressive educational mission, but it sits in the middle of a former agrarian estate in the Western Reserve. So it's within a traditional kind of vernacular context. And it was a competition that we pursued, and at the beginning, this is kind of an image. Hawkins' premise is always about fair play and the fact that they want to educate the whole body or the whole person. So we started with this kind of organizational premise that oversimplification, that education could be broken down into three components: making, sharing, and inquiry. That we make things to learn, we share things with each other to learn, and we do some kind of silent, isolated inquiry to learn. And so we kind of took those ideas and we said, okay, what does it mean to do a new school for, or an addition to a school for school with a progressive educational mission on an agrarian estate with these kind of lost landscapes. So this landscape was kind of something we found. There was no access to this place. I should talk about, sorry, this quick. There was also a barn on the campus that was a working barn. It was a working farm at one point that burned down in 1977. And so this kind of typology of distributed volumes really kind of impacted us. This is the Great Lawn. This is the existing school, the existing White House, which is historic, and then you can see the kind of roadway. So that picture of the wall is kind of back in here. So we organized the program according to making. We put it in the woods, which had views of this kind of old route, which used to be when the estate was working, they would bring the carriages down, and this bridge was kind of dilapidated. And then sharing, which was kind of these kind of communal social spaces along the meadow with these vast views of the valley. And then inquiry, which was an orchard. We wanted it to be a working orchard. It's a cherry orchard. Ultimately, it didn't exist, but it was important for us to kind of put the humanities along this kind of orchard of learning, so to speak. So you see that here are additions here. The main premise was to kind of build without corridors and leave ample open space for kind of the social types of learning. We didn't want to kind of come down the corridor and come to classes. So we did a renovation and an addition. So the sciences and biology were down kind of in the wood. Sorry, jumped way ahead. We're in the woods. The kind of academic commons and library were around this kind of large courtyard on the meadow, and the humanities were along the orchard. The other main premise was this kind of loose fit. We wondered what it would mean for school to be in a barn. So we ultimately kind of created that. It's all one space, it's all one volume, and all of the classrooms let out into that volume. So you're no longer kind of going down an anonymous corridor to go to class, you're kind of coming out, seeing your peers before going to class. And this kind of idea of being lofted all within the same space, sharing that communal space, kind of views out to the Great Lawn, to the, you can't quite see the bridge in this image. And then this idea that the building moves out of the way of the landscape as much as the landscape moves out of the way of the building is always important. So these kind of overhangs, this is the fabrication lab, so when parents come and drop their kids off, you kind of get a lot of visibility into that. So this series of kind of vernacular but kind of contemporary unvernacular forms that sit in the meadow, kind of highly exaggerated porches. It was, again, a lot of the people interested in Hawken are of a traditional taste culture, so we had to find ways to kind of build in kind of more contemporary forms. So this is a place to wait for your parents, carving away for terraces, integration into the landscape. This is Ham Martin. This project is maybe a work in progress. They're in Round Pond, Maine. I started this project in 2010. It's still not done. It's a real collaboration because Ham, at 65, decided he wanted to build his own cottage. They had this cottage in the family for about 25 years. Round Pond is in Maine, right off the Atlantic. It's kind of a small lobster fishery. And the family always came here, but it was an old Victorian cottage, no insulation, couldn't be occupied in the winter. So the idea was, we don't want to kill the old cottage. We don't want to go in and insulate it and change what it is. We just want a place where we can kind of, a little cave where we can hole up when it's really cold outside, and then we want to be able to expand into this larger environment when the family comes. This is the view from above the ridge of the existing house. This view doesn't exist except for now. It didn't exist before. This is one of the lobster fisheries. And they use the barn and they use these facilities for family events. I mean, this project was a very personal project in that way, and also kind of a labor of love for him. So we couldn't, because we were in the creek shed, we couldn't expand the footprint. So we actually kind of came right out to, we even used the porch as part of the footprint. And this was the summer kitchen. So we had the barn, the existing house, and the summer kitchen. So we were able to kind of take that 18-foot by 18-foot volume and take it up vertically into a belvedere. And then we really just kind of configured each of the spaces within to orient to a site. So the same way Hawken kind of says making is in the woods and sharing is on the meadow, this says, there's an intimate kind of den that looks out at the brook. There's a court with the kitchen that kind of looks out to where the kids play. And then at the top, there's this kind of belvedere where I get to enjoy the long views that I can't otherwise enjoy. Ham likes to dabble in concrete. So this is Ham's wall. It's really the kind of straw that stirs the drink. It's in the center. And the whole project was really a procession coming from the courtyard, moving around and up and through and kind of getting to this belvedere and this view. So on the ground floor, small kitchen area. We also kind of interceded in the existing by putting this kind of long sliding wall, which Ham hasn't built yet, but he's going to, as a way to kind of expand in certain seasons in this kind of small den room. The second floor was really only a restroom that worked off their existing master bedroom. So you kind of come up the steps. She has a small like reading nook that's kind of tucked in here. Come up the steps further and arrive at kind of the pond room, which has a little roof terrace. So this is the idea of when it's in the summer and when the kids are there and we can expand. And this is what we do in the winter when we kind of live in this small volume. Right when I left Westlake Reed Laskoski, I went up there for a week to decompress, and I helped him frame the second floor. So this is from that. But he literally did everything. It's all radiant heating in the slab, and the kind of center wall is also radiant heating. So all the infrastructure lives in that one center wall and kind of emanates out. So that notion of the hearth. This is their scrim. I mean, what I love about this is that this is kind of real people living their way in contemporary architecture, but they really wanted it to be simple. But they've said, this is a room nobody would make. It's only about 7.5 feet wide, and it's long, and it's under a stair, and everybody who comes over loves to hang out down there because there's something about the way they've made it, the kind of coziness. They tiled the restroom. They wanted some light in the restroom, so even though it's central, we put in this glass block wall, which Ham put in, that kind of borrows light from here, so you get that stair kind of coming up. Ham poured all the kitchen countertops, poured floor. He made this table. This is Ham and Mary. And when you get to the top, you get this kind of amazing view that their grandkids get to enjoy, and then you get to feel like you're in a treehouse. This is kind of the porch overlooking the view. And from there, and I think this photograph kind of resonates, for me, it is the project, which is this idea of kind of in Hemingway's words, kind of a warm, well-lit space. That's really what this is for them. Pretty satisfying. Sorry, I'm gonna quicken up. Disciples Christian Church also wanting to make kind of a home for a congregation that's in a normal kind of circumstance for congregations. So they have a 1960s building that's 27,000 square feet, and they're only a congregation of 150 to 160 parishioners or members. And so what we needed to do here was basically kind of take them out of this building, which the mechanical systems basically was falling apart. You see it here, 2,700 square feet, kind of sprawling. They were gonna have to replace the roof, do all kinds of things. And in a land swap deal with the developer would get 3 of the 4 acres, and on a small plot, we would build a new 10,000 square foot church. And these would be townhomes by the developer, and the parking would be shared. So that church was really, to go from 27,000 to 10, you have to find flexibility. So the fellowship and sanctuary had to talk to each other. And then each of the classrooms that they were going from 7 classrooms to 3 had to serve multiple purposes. So what we did is we kind of organized each of those classrooms around an exterior landscape that was embedded within the church and otherwise had a very simple volume with a sanctuary and a fellowship hall and these series of, what we called kind of the wedding court, here, the kind of memorial garden here, and a little terrarium that kind of separated some of the classrooms from the offices, kind of in this simple grouping. And we really just wanted to find kind of ways to bring light in that were economical, but also kind of felt really significant. This is the kind of memorial garden, this kind of sliver of space off of the sanctuary where they would locate all the urns that they had. And in the lobby, there would be this kind of terrarium that would introduce natural light, both coming and going from the various classrooms. And then the form was really taken from this, they introduced the idea of this kind of, the church as the rock and the kind of stability of that. And so quite literally what we came up with was this kind of roofscape that surmounted the entire church that kind of merged this series of platonic volumes into kind of a cohesive whole. So the roof became the form, became the landscape, and became very simple materially. I think I have two more. I guess I can finish, I think. This is the Diane Arbus photograph of twins. This is the contact sheet of twins. So this house for a client on South Lane is, the client has an amazing fine art photography collection, but they're one of the only people who have a collection of contact sheets. There's going to be an exhibition at the Cleveland Museum of Art of these contact sheets in another year or so. But what I thought was fascinating about the contact sheets is you get to see as much about what the artist didn't do or didn't select as what they did select. And nobody collected these contact sheets when they started collecting them, and they have a whole, I mean, it's a fascinating collection. But this idea that you could have exposure to the process was fascinating. Also, I know some of you in your studio are doing some photography things, so this might be meaningful, but photography is the one art form that is most susceptible to natural light in terms of needing to protect it. It's just very fragile. So the Chagrin River, the site that kind of was at the edge, kind of overlooking, and the site was really about these kind of long views. So how do you meld this kind of inner artscape with this exterior landscape, which is really quite expansive? So we really just kind of surmounted that, that location. And the core idea I'm going to build up here, but is again this kind of idea of semi-assertive symmetries or twinnings or these kind of dualities, where we really wanted a central living gallery that was about life, and that you didn't have to have a separate gallery. This is the Brown sisters. It's a collection of, I think it stopped at 40 for some inauspicious reasons, but the photographer took a picture of these sisters every year for 40 years, and so it's really just kind of an ordered center, and then we scattered around the perimeter all of the functions that make up the daily life of a house. So kitchens, bathrooms, restrooms would sit in the landscape. And then we'd carve away at those volumes in order to capture these kind of key views within the landscape. And ultimately it became kind of a very simple diagram that's about this kind of ordered interior landscape that is about the gallery and the art and doesn't have direct natural light. And then this exterior landscape, which is expansive and kind of wild and ready to be engaged. So it was all about framing views inside and out, and this idea of kind of the oblique and the perspectival. So the building frames views from the landscape in, and the kind of art and landscape within kind of frames views to the outside. Here you see that kind of central volume: dining, entertaining, living, gallery, kitchen, terrace, family room, garage, all the components around the perimeter. And this idea of photography came into play where, if you remember that diagram, when you enter the main gallery, you're kind of confronted with art, but there's always something oblique, which is about the exterior. So by doing this kind of symmetrical play, you're actually giving a kind of frontality to the art and an oblique quality to the landscape. So, at the diagonal, at the way I kind of navigate, I kind of see from inside to outside to inside to outside again, and kind of this kind of referential kind of quality that to me was very much about kind of the picture and the kind of perspectival image. Move through that central space on the oblique. We were dealing in the center with kind of natural light in various ways. So you can see we calculated not very difficultly, I guess, but we calculated the roof to never let direct light onto the photographs. So it's important that this gallery has no windows directly out. All of the windows are actually exterior to that in this kind of angawa space that's on the outside. So you're always looking through the gallery, but never directly outside. And so at the heart of this thing is this space that's connected to the exterior, but not directly. And that play, I think, was something that was really compelling. Central gallery and then the volumes around. And even the exterior volumes would kind of try to frame views, this kind of ambiguity, spaces that would be embedded and comfortable. The client is widowed for about 4 years now, and so she wanted to have spaces that were very intimate. She's kind of introspective. She was a psychologist who has this great collection, but also could enjoy the exterior, framing that in different ways, kind of tight spaces. So again, just trying to create variety within that. And then we created kind of our own contact sheet. We went way overboard on the renderings. I don't suggest anybody do this, but it was like this contact sheet of moments in and around the house. And this kind of duality of being outside and inside. And the last project is the project that's also currently in progress, not quite at the stage of the previous one, for a client that also collects art and also has this view. So it's one of the great houses in Cleveland. It's right on this escarpment. It looks out nightly here. So they are an elderly couple, and they may not be able to move up and down stairs for a lot longer. So the idea is that they don't want to go somewhere else to live. They love their house. So how do we get something on the ground floor that accommodates their future life in this place and let them kind of live with dignity for a long time? They also have an amazing art collection. This is Warhol of Mao, not Warhol of Kafka. So the project kind of lives at the intersection of this view and this art and making space out of that. The house is very formal, no corridors. The rooms are highly kind of, again, semi-assertive asymmetrically. They're kind of these twins, so that was like a strong motivation in the project. You get these kind of central axes, even the axes. This is Cleveland on a normal day, not the day I showed you before. So the idea was, we would create kind of a simple single volume that allowed circulation around the perimeter, had a central core that would be a master bedroom, and also be able to show art. The other trick with this is, how do you add a master bedroom to a ground floor of a house that's already 6,200 square feet? It's not really necessary for the future of the house, right? They're not extravagant people, but they want to be prudent. So the whole design of this was about adding this space to the house, but making it flexible in the future in the context of what the architecture of the house is, not just in the context of the client. So it really became about this kind of volume with this perimeter, and again, this kind of here, like rotational symmetry that occurred. But the other detail, and I don't think they'd mind me saying this, but at this point they don't sleep in the same rooms. One's a night owl, one rises early. They just have different schedules. They live, they have a beautiful life together, but they don't keep the same schedules. So not only did this have to be one bedroom, but it actually had to be 2 bedrooms, which we thought was doubly outrageous to add 2 bedrooms to a 62,000 or 6,200 square foot house. So this is Thomas Jefferson's bed. His study, this is in Monticello. His study's on the far side. His dressing room is on this side. And I've always been kind of obsessed with this. I mean, I think it's like the most remarkable, one of the most remarkable spaces of this era, which is, the idea that he works on one side, he goes to bed, he pulls the curtain, he wakes up on the other side. And just this, it's almost like this architectural idea of I'd never want to leave my work, but also the idea of occupying a wall. So we think about this often in 2 or 3 feet, but what does it mean in 5 or 6 feet? So the notion was that we would kind of create that centripetal organization. We would have a main bedroom with a full king-size bed, and these cabinets would ultimately separate it, but we would insert what we called the TJ bed, Thomas Jefferson bed for Bob, right off of his study. So this is his study. This is the normal way into the bedroom. He would be able to kind of use the facilities after hours without disturbing, but they were still open to each other, and ultimately we could imagine that this becomes an entertainment unit and somebody puts a sectional sofa in here and it's a place to entertain. So this is that space, kind of an art gallery until they need it, and then it becomes a bedroom. And then this is the bedroom. And again, this idea that the layering that I shared earlier is really kind of critical for another reason, which is this notion of kind of privacy, that we can open the space up, but at certain angles, one side is very private. It falls off a cliff and nobody can see you. So you can be open to that side, but you can let in natural light and kind of engage that experience and have art kind of oriented adjacent to that. So this is this kind of very thin exit way, the bedroom space. Night and by day. We started working on the skin. It's right now we're trying to mimic the color of the grout of the existing house and do these kind of custom concrete panels. We work with there's a great precast concrete supplier in Cleveland who supplies all over the country, and trying to just do something kind of very subtle and rhythmic and ultimately kind of capture that view for them. So I think that's it. I apologize. I meant to be 10 minutes early and I'm not, but I'll hang out for questions if anybody has any.
All right, so we got time maybe for one or two questions. Anybody have any questions you'd like to ask Jonathan?
You're like, he talked too long anyway.
Okay. All right, well, thanks again to Jonathan for coming today.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.